Expand your mind, don't let it wither and die. You'll find that it lifts your spirits high to the sky. So meditate.
Thanks for joining me today. Let's start off a little bit. You know, I wanted to reach out because and chat with you because I'm highly fascinated by history. I think, you know, when I growing up and looking back, I feel like if I had to choose, like, history, besides obviously phys ed, was probably my favorite subject in school. And I think I was fortunate enough to have a couple teachers that really were good at it as well, and the way they conveyed it, which really made it more engaging, I think. And so, you know, I've always really believed that you can learn a lot from history, and if you don't know the past, you are for sure going to repeat it. And so I appreciate you coming on today and chatting with me about specifically the presidents. Something that I think, you know, I feel like there's a bit of a lost knowledge when it comes to, like, civics and things like that in our nation in general. I don't feel like it's really taught that much these days. And so I appreciate you being here to kind of chat about this, and hopefully some people may learn some things today. So appreciate you. Why don't you start off just real briefly, kind of tell people a little bit about yourself, how you got into history. You know, have you always been kind of a geek on it, or, you know, is it something that you've developed over time, or just give people a little bit of background before we jump into everything.
Yeah, thanks. It's a pleasure to be on here. I, like you, have always been really interested in history. I've always been, from like a young age, a bookworm and someone who is really interested in reading the news. I remember when I was in college, I just took so many history classes because I thought they were fun. Then when it came time to graduate, they're like, you have a minor in history. And I was like, oh, cool. I wasn't aiming for that. That's a funny accident. And then after I graduated, my first career was initially in journalism. And one of the things that I liked about journalism is it felt like you were writing the first draft of history, was the great phrase about journalism that I always really liked. So the reasons I like history is because it gives you so much perspective to things that are happening now. You know, you always hear people say, like, this is the worst, this is the best, this is, you know, like the extra, this has never happened before, this is unprecedented. And you can look back and be like, oh, no, like this, something like this has happened before, or the idea you're proposing, someone has tried something like that before. Here's what happened. What can we learn from that? You know, and your own life, like all of us, we deal with our own struggles in life. And when you look at all the struggle that's happened in history, it just puts a lot more perspective on whatever you're dealing with too. So it's a great humbleizer and makes you realize, like, man, this thing I'm dealing with might be annoying, but oh boy, it could be worse. So these are all the reasons I've been attracted to history. And then what led me to my particular project, Abridged Presidential Histories, is my podcast where I tell the story of each president in order, their successes, scandals, and failures, each one in 60 minutes or less. And how I started on that journey is I was reading biographies of all the presidents. I thought that would be a real fun project because, like you said, there's a big gap in what we know about our presidents. This all started, I was having I was sitting at a bar with a friend, and I was like, hey, you know, it'd be a fun, very nerdy challenge. Let's see if we can name each president in order and 3 things they did.
Wow.
And, you know, and you start off and you're like, okay, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, you know, or Adams. Look at me, I'm already missing one. Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. And then pretty quickly you're like, was it John Quincy after that? And by the time you're at the late 19th century, you're like, okay, there were like a bunch of guys with beards. I don't know what any of them did. And coming out of that, I was like, it would be fun to read a biography on every president to help fill this out for me. What you know, these people at their time were viewed just as importantly as we look at presidents today. So what was happening? Things were important, were happening. Why aren't we talking about them? What were they? What can we learn from them? And so I started reading these biographies and taking notes. And then I launched the podcast because I'm someone, former journalist. I love being a storyteller. In my day now, I work in like program management for Nike. So I'm not telling stories the way I used to in my day job. So this is my way to get that hit of storytelling.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's interesting. I recently caught a book, was called what was it? Maybe it was called The Reason or something like that. It was all about the Revolutionary War. The Cause, that's what it was called.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, and it really I found it interesting because you sort of have this, I don't know, abridged, glorified version of how the nation sort of started. And this book really went into like how it was such a struggle and how there was like, most of Washington's time was spent, it seemed like, retreating and moving around and just surviving and trying to hold on to keeping enough people in the military to even continue the Revolutionary War. Like it was I sometimes feel like we get a glossed over sort of rendition of history. And I think it's important to have, people like yourself, even, just out there kind of doing the deep dive into this and have, these kind of books like the Cause, just to kind of really get into the nitty gritty and give the proper perspective to it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, let's kind of start off with in the beginning, leading into that, one of the people that I think everybody recognizes is George Washington and his accomplishments. And I think two things to me always stuck out about him, and that was one, and I have so much more a greater understanding as an older individual now, having done some additional reading, on what he actually struggled through before he ever became president. And to me, that was probably one part of what really impressed me about him. And also just the fact that he was kind of in a position to where I think he could have like really grabbed power if he wanted to. And the restraint that or I don't know if he was wise or if he was just tired at that point or what his reasoning was, but the not many people would walk away from. I can't think of a single politician that would have walked away from that today, if they were in that situation.
Yeah, I agree. Washington is such an interesting character. Someone asked me recently, Kenny, if you could take any one president and make an HBO miniseries about them, who would it be? And I said George Washington, because there's just so much more interesting stuff to that story than people know. They just look at him. He's deified now. Right. He's deified as he was the first president, the founding father. He can do no wrong. Everybody loves him. No, everybody did not love him back then. He was getting hate mail. People were like borderline rioting on the streets at times, really unhappy with some of his decisions. His own Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, was secretly organizing a political party to oppose him. He was not this universally beloved figure. And the other thing is the United States was so vulnerable at the time, too. Like when he becomes president, he's the president of like the third world country at the edge of the map. Nobody cares about the United States. We could be blown over by a stiff wind. We just trashed our first government because it failed. What are you doing? You are taking a huge gamble on government number two. So there's so much more interesting stuff to his story than people say. And, you're right. You talk about like, what was he really? What was George Washington really? And again, this comes to these things that you can learn from history and the context, as I think, a more beautiful picture than this untouchable, unobtainable, like nobody can ever be George Washington again. He was so perfect, this deification. You need to get rid of that and need to realize that as a general, his one superpower was really not losing. It wasn't winning. Right. He didn't win many battles, but he was really good at running away, really good at retreating, really good at avoiding a fight, which was what you had to do back then, And like if people knew more about that of his history, like how would that change the national psyche and how we approach, challenges and realizing that, okay, sometimes you can't just attack everything. You need to find the right moment. You need to be opportunistic. You need to play with the resources you got. And he struggled too. It's really funny. George Washington favored strong central government. Why did he favor strong central government? Because nobody gave him any supplies during the Revolutionary War. I mean, he's like, we all know about Valley Forge. He's sitting there freezing and starving at Valley Forge, and the local farmers won't even sell him food because they're selling it to the British instead because the British have more money. You know, like it's just crazy the things he had to deal with. So yes, I forget what started me on that rant, but George Washington is like all these people in history. There's so much more contextualizing to them that make them more relatable and make them more human and more people that we can learn from. That is lost if you just remember your, what you learned in elementary school, which was really propaganda. That was propaganda to make you a good little citizen. You know, you need to grow up at some point and grab a book and learn that next layer. George Washington owned slaves. Okay, he freed them all, but he also, some ran away and he sent slave catchers after him. Oh shit! Like, this guy's more complex than we give him credit than we give him credit for, and I think that's an important thing to capture.
Well, yeah, I think too often, even today, we sort of idolize people or celebritize people. And it's, look, everybody's a human being, and humans, sometimes we do great things and sometimes we do terrible things. And we try to find a good balance, I think, overall for humanity overall. But nobody's perfect, obviously. And
right.
Look, I think a couple things that as you were going there kind of stuck out to me. One is, the struggles with resources. And it made me think back. It made me think back to right off the bat, the very first army the United States ever has. As soon as they get out of that, they kind of get just discarded, just like they, today with veterans. Like, it's continued. It started at the very beginning, and they've never been given the resources or support. And I think that's a great point as to why he kind of supported that more centralized government.
Yeah, the treatment of veterans in U.S. history is such an interesting thing. Starting from the Revolutionary War, the veterans who served, they were given these like kind of promissory notes of land down the road, but it's worth nothing at the time. And so some of them sold that because they needed money now. And then when the United States won, it was suddenly worth a lot of money. And that was one of the first conflicts of, should we force people who bought these promissory notes to give them back to the veterans, or the veterans who sold their land for a little bit of money, but now it's worth more if they kept it? Like, should they, or is it just out of luck? And how we support that, like, you go to the Civil War. After the Civil War, you had all these veterans who are like, okay, I did not get paid enough. My friends who stayed home made a lot of money while I was in the Civil War. Like, what are we going to do? They ended up passing a giant bonus for those guys. It was actually the first Social Security program in U.S. history, effectively, was passed in the 19th century for Civil War veterans, something to give them a stipend to live on, which, like, this thing for Civil War veterans, it was paying off till just a few years ago. Like, there was some, I know, it's crazy. There was some Civil War veteran. I think it was, like, if I remember right, it's the guy who fled the Confederate Army, joined the Union, so he gets the Union stipend. When he was really old, he had a child, and that child was a little bit disabled, so they got some of these benefits too, and they lived to be really old. And so, there was like a 90-something or 100-year-old woman, like, a few years ago, who was collecting like $20 a month of Civil War benefits. And she was the last person like that's what that looked like for the Civil War. After World War I, again, these guys, they went off, they fought in World War I, they come home, and they're like, man, all my friends who didn't get drafted made a lot more money. I'm suffering. A lot of them were farmers, and farming actually suffered a bit in the 20s, even though a lot of the economy was good. And they're like, where's something for me? I want something. So they eventually get, again, another bonus bill passed of, we're now going to get paid money later for the service during the war. It's not until like FDR and the GI Bill and things like that you start getting a more permanent, how are we going to support our veterans with education, with housing, with other benefits, with healthcare? It took us over 150 years to figure that out. And there were so many other wars that came and went, like Mexican-American War. I don't think those guys got anything, War of 1812. Man, like, no, those guys didn't get anything.
The fun of it.
Yeah, they got a story to tell, like that's it. So there are so many things. It's so important, and this is one of those other things is government is never final. It's never static. It's never like the first solution wasn't the final one. We're constantly iterating. And how can we be better? How can we better serve our people? How can we address the challenges of today, the challenges we didn't see yesterday, the challenges we don't see coming tomorrow? And that's another one thing that history really teaches you that's valuable is you need to be flexible and willing to change and willing to look at what do we need today? What will we need tomorrow? Who cares what we needed yesterday? Those are the countries, those are the powers that survive.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's very easy to say that we should either have hey, dictatorships are very easy. There's one guy, he makes all the decisions. Socialism, complete socialism in its purest form, everybody's equal and everybody has everything. It's easy to think there's nothing to think about per se. Democracy combined with capitalism, it's a complex system and it's always going to require the constant effort to keep from going too far this way, too far that way, too far any which way, because you want to keep moving forward. And just, it requires a constant effort of checks and balances. And I think that's something sometimes people forget about. They're like, well, we've been here for 200 years. We've had our democracy this whole time and it's fine and it's stable. And it's it takes work. Like anything, it takes work.
Yeah. The thing we should never forget is the United States government was founded by a bunch of huge nerds who were obsessed with the Roman Republic. And they built everything. They modeled it after the Roman Republic in many ways, not perfectly, but in many ways. And we should always remember what happened to the Roman Republic. A dictator took over, like it collapsed into an empire. There's a quote, I think it's Winston Churchill or John, I can't remember who said it, but there was one of those early guys who said maybe it was John Adams. There's never been a democracy that didn't commit suicide. And that was true. Like we were trying this form of government that had been discarded for hundreds of years because the early attempts at it had all collapsed into dictatorship. So you absolutely need to keep an eye on how is your government meeting the needs of its people today, and the people who are offering solutions, what do they really want? Because you also got to look out for the populists who are just using populism as a tool to become powerful. It's really weird. It's what do you do when the person who seems to be offering the solutions that will help everybody, and maybe these are really good solutions, but what if they're just doing that to take power and seize power and destroy democracy? How do you extract the solutions and deny the poison? So these are some of the challenges that democracies face.
Yeah, you mentioned there that the first few, our forefathers were kind of a bunch of nerds. I would say Washington doesn't necessarily strike me that way, but certainly I think starting with Adams, maybe Jefferson, Madison, and maybe up to the second Adams, John Quincy.
Yeah.
Maybe that group were they all kind of like they were all kind of a little bit bookwormy, really into like the politicals nuances and the French system and the politics that was going on at that time. Do I have that kind of correct?
Yeah, they were all huge nerds. It was Roman history was such a fetish back then that Americans one of the most common ways to try to get your views out there. What today, you go on the news and you give yourself like a 30-second interview on CNN or Fox or MSNBC. Like that's how you get your stuff out there today. Back then you did it by writing letters that you signed with a Roman pseudonym, So it would be like Constantinus or Plutarch or, I think Plutarch's Greek, my bad. But, you'd sign it with like a Roman guy that everybody knew because everybody was reading Roman history back then. You talked earlier about George Washington. George Washington, you're right. He wasn't as book nerdy. He didn't get the education that all those other guys got. And he always kind of felt a little insecure because of that. But he was still aware of the stuff because he was in the upper class and everybody in the upper class was aware of this stuff. And he very much, you mentioned stepping away from power, stepping away from ultimate control. Like who does that? He was modeling himself over a Roman guy named Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was a Roman consul who, maybe not a consul, he was a Roman guy who was made dictator during a time of threat to the Roman Republic. Rome was a republic, but they realized the threat was so bad that they're like, for this temporary moment, To defeat the enemy who might destroy us, we need a dictator. Cincinnatus, you're a former general living on a farm. You're a farmer. Please come off your farm, and we will give you total power, absolute power over everything to solve this problem. And then we really hope you go back to your farm. And he did. He came, he saved Rome, he went back to his farm. And then Rome got threatened again. He did it twice. So George Washington was trying to be Cincinnatus. And when he stepped down from this chance of ultimate power, his officers, they formed a like, I forget the exact name of it. It was like basically the Fellowship of Cincinnatus in his honor. It's where we get the name Cincinnati. The city Cincinnati is an honor, an homage to how George Washington had emulated this Roman hero Cincinnatus by stepping away from ultimate power when he could have seized it and letting a democracy grow instead. So, but yeah, to go to your point, these guys, the other ones especially, super nerds. They all studied, and in fact, it was their undoing at the end. John Quincy, you mentioned the last one of them. John Quincy studied in Europe. He traveled Europe with his dad. His dad was a diplomat, so he came along and he studied, he saw the world. And when he was president, he was like, hey guys, I've seen what's happening in Europe. We need to step up our game. We need more universities. We need more public works. Like, you don't know what our competition's doing because you haven't been over there. I've seen it. If we want to be a mighty country, we need this development and investment. And the American people are just like, nah. He didn't know how to convince them.
Right.
And after that, you really have a relapse. Like, he's followed by Andrew Jackson, the most like, aw shucks, just the uneducated, shoot from the hip, backwoods American possibly ever, and then you start, politics takes more of that direction with Jacksonian democracy. So yeah, the early guys were a bunch of nerds, and then we definitely pivoted pretty hard with Andrew Jackson.
It's interesting. It goes through that group of people, who are all, like you said, of this one kind of demeanor or one kind of knowledge base, personalities maybe. Even Adams, I think he even, if I'm not mistaken, I think he died like in Congress or something. He like died at work. John Quincy, yes. I think like he was like the ultimate statesman. And then, like you said, after back to back people like this, we basically elected, I don't know, our first Trump. Like,
so some would say that,
like
a populist. Like I was saying before, a populist. When someone rises in democracy who just tells people what they want, you get these populist leaders sometimes. And democracy had going through a process of expanding then too. This first generation, when they founded democracy, they founded it for guys like them. You had to be a rich white guy who owned land. It was not a broad voting base. They expected elections to be settled in the electoral college and electors to be picked by senators. They expected this to be a basically an oligarchy. They call it democracy, but it's going to be led by the elite only. Right. Everybody else is just along for the ride. And in the early 19th century, you start to have an expansion of who can vote. Maybe you don't have to own as much property. Maybe more guys can vote. Maybe we can let more of the poor people vote. Maybe electors are chosen directly. Maybe we're changing the way we elect our presidents. Excuse me. Maybe it's not the state Senate houses. Maybe we start trying other things. And that is what leads to, a populist like Jackson getting elected. Now, Jackson he'd been a senator. He was a successful general. He'd been around D.C., so he had some affluent allies as well, Was a bit of it seemed like from the very beginning, just disregarded things. Wasn't it during, was it Madison or Monroe's presidency? Whichever one of them obtained Florida. And I think he was told not to go do it. And he was like, I'll just go take it by force. And then he was told not to. And he's like, and he just did it anyway. And then came back in and was like, hey, look what I did. like a dog, looking for his reward. Yeah. If I remember right, like he might have asked for permission and James Monroe just like didn't answer or something like that. And later there'd be arguments about was a letter lost in the mail. His last orders had been don't do it, and he did it. And some people were upset, but possession's 9/10 of the law, and now we have Florida. Yeah, Andrew Jackson was just a guy who did whatever the hell he wanted. He is someone that when he would be put in authority of places, he would regularly like throw people in jail, and judges would be like, you can't do that. You're exceeding the law. This is dictatorial. This is you shouldn't do that. When he was down in Florida, he just summarily executed a couple British citizens because he thought they were supporting the Native American folks he was fighting at the time. You know, it was almost a big international scandal. He's one of these guys who he's just going to do whatever he wants to do. Doesn't care what anybody else has to say or what the rules written down are, which is another thing history teaches you is whatever the rules are written down, they don't really matter. That's one of the other crazy lessons of history is if you are popular enough, that's what matters. And you can do whatever you want. That was potentially the lesson of January 6th, not too long ago. If you got people who will do things like it doesn't really matter what the rules are. What matters is what can you do? Yeah, that's all that matters.
Yeah, it's interesting. You said, he was the first, Jackson was really kind of the first populist. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he kind of really changed his approach from how the other presidents before him had interacted and communicated with the general populace as where, if I'm not mistaken, I think Jackson actually, really was the first president to kind of go out and actually travel the U.S., to some extent. And actually, didn't he also like just invite all the commoners to the White House for his inaugural party?
He wasn't the first to travel the U.S. If I remember right, George Washington, I want to say, traveled the U.S. So there were fewer states then, so It was easier. I could be wrong, but I think he like went north and such. Jackson and Thomas Jefferson was another guy who certainly put on the airs of being a populist. He did a really good job at presenting himself as I'm just one of you. Like he's legendary for greeting visitors at the White House wearing a robe and slippers, which the funny thing though about him is that when people weren't looking, he was like all about his French powdered wigs, and he was a total Francophile and like super wealthy and lived on debt and in no way relatable to the average person. But he was born about Jackson was a guy who was born poor. He was like an orphan when he was a kid. In the Revolutionary War as a child, he'd been captured and slashed by a British person in prison. He'd been a hooligan when he was growing up. Like he's kind of one of these guys that came up from nothing. He's one of the first presidents that came up from nothing, and he realized as the voting rolls expanded. And just through the experiences he had in life, he's one of the people that realized if you have a mob behind you, the rules don't really matter. So that's why he opened up, and that's why he really catered to people. He really catered to what are the sentiments of what people want. If I have enough people that want something and they're willing to show up for it, then we can probably get it. And he did. He opened up. He invited people along. He showed up for folks. People felt like he was touchable, like he was tangible, like they could see him. He felt more like them than John Quincy certainly ever did.
Yeah. Do you think his previous experience of growing up, maybe not being as educated or experienced with, the nuances of economy, do you think that's what kind of led him to have such a disdain for the central bank and the Treasury? Didn't he veto that, which kind of like tanked the economy right after he left office, pretty much?
Yeah. It's so funny. Early American history, you're reading it and you're like, why do they keep talking about banks? It's nothing but fights about like, well, we have a central bank. What should our tariff policy be? You're like, wait, where's the exciting stuff? This is all really nerdy. Do I have to write? Yes, I do have to write about this because this was like the biggest issue of the day. So in a sense, some things don't change. Americans have never liked banks, have never liked bankers. We've always been suspicious of them. And back then, in large part, people who, like you mentioned, he grew up, poor. He grew up a hardworking American, doing whatever he could. And folks like that, when they went into town, they saw the bankers with all this wealth, and they're like, your hands are clean. Your clothes are clean. what work are you doing? My hands are dirty because I'm in the field digging. I'm working in the shop. My clothes are all covered in soot or dirt or grime and sweat. Why are you making money? It just doesn't make sense. So there is always this baked in resentment toward bankers. And, banking is also kind of hard to explain. There's a lot of the interests and this and that and the other. It's very easy to be kind of out of touch and be like, oh, I just don't want to think about that. That's complicated. So when you're trying to explain what's the value of a bank, a lot of Americans never got it. And when you had the first parties pop up, Hamilton versus Jefferson, one of the core issues was the first bank of the United States. Should it exist or should it not exist? And the reason that some folks felt it should exist is that if you have a bank, it can develop credit and it can show that it's good at paying off loans, and then you can borrow more money. And the Americans who learned this, they learned this by looking at the British and being like, how are the Brits paying for their empire? How are they paying for all these wars? Oh, they're borrowing money. They're borrowing a lot of money. How are they borrowing money? Because they have a bank. Oh, maybe we should do that, So there was a push for the bank. But as I said, a lot of people resented banks. A lot of people didn't like banks. Sometimes banks make mistakes. Sometimes banks give loans to the wrong people, and then those loans fail, and then you have an economic crisis. And then you're blaming the banks because you're like, I can't sell it in my food because the bank messed up and it gave loans to the wrong people and the economy just collapsed. So you had this real tension for the first 100 years of should there or shouldn't there be a bank. I'll get to Jackson's in a second, but the first Bank of the United States, interestingly, was killed by one of these guys we talked about a second ago. I believe it was James Madison. Well, James Madison was president. His party opposed banks, and it got killed on his watch. He basically stayed out of the fight. He campaigned on killing the bank, and then he became president. He realized it's kind of important, so he stayed out of the fight, and Congress killed it. And then we went to the War of 1812, and we're fighting England. And we're like, okay, how are we going to pay for this war? Well, we have a few sources of money. One is tariffs from trade, but we had just self-imposed an embargo, so we were not having any trade. Plus, Britain controlled the seas anyway, so we have zero tariffs. Great, okay, no revenue there. Well, the bank, no, we just closed the bank. We can't take any loans out. Okay, we can't get money from the bank. Taxes, our party's fundamentally opposed to taxes. It was a crisis. How do we pay for that war? Right. After the war, they created the bank again. They were like, that was a huge mistake. Let's reopen the bank. And then you get to Jackson, but still, people are like, oh, you reopened the bank. That was a terrible idea. So Jackson kills it again. And yes, it hurts the economy. Jackson also did some other things. The way he was trying to get certain currency, the way he was playing with currencies didn't help either. There was no, states had their own notes back then, and he was trying to tinker around with that. Jackson started moving all the money from the U.S. bank to these regional banks. And then the regional banks were making the same bad loans that the central bank was, but the regional banks were less disciplined. So worse loans were being made, and another crisis happened anyway. So yes, he opposed the bank. Banks are hard to understand. They're important. We eventually found a different solution. Does this new solution work? Now we're with the Fed. We don't have a Bank of the United States anymore. We have the Fed. The Fed can adjust interest rates, but we still had these cycles of boom and bust. We've had the Great Recession. We've still seen other things. Is this the right solution? Like I said, you have to keep looking for a better solution. Just because we have the Fed doesn't mean it's necessarily the right solution and the perfect one. Is there a better one out there? So that was quite the rant in response to your thing about banks. Yeah, no, I like that. It's a good way to put it. Again, it's a thing of constant improvement. One last thing I would throw in about Jackson is famously he was not afraid to throw down and duel. I think he had, I don't know how many duels he was in, but I think he had 10 or 12 bullets in his body when he died, right? That were lodged in him in different places. Yeah, I think he had at least one or two in him. Others had probably passed through him. He had fought in many duels and, been in conflicts. He was old Andrew Jackson looks like a creature from a movie that you'd expect would be evil, because his body is just like he's racked with pain from all these war wounds, and like he's just constantly hurting. He's crippled. It hurts to move. Everything just hurts all the time. He has a bullet in him. There's some speculation, if I remember right, that one of the things that killed him might have been lead poisoning from a bullet that had been sitting in his body for so long. He threw down. He fought a lot of duels. He was absolutely crazy. He just loved to fight. That was his reaction, which is another lesson of Americans, is Americans love a fighter. Yeah. If you say you'll fight for people, they like that. They like that in their politicians, and Jackson, boy, did that guy love to fight, especially if you said anything negative about his wife. If you said anything bad about his wife, he was just going to challenge you to a duel right there and like, let's go now over there. I got my gun. Let's fight. He was involved in a shootout once, walking through towns. This wasn't even a duel. He's just walking through town. He sees a guy he doesn't like. They start shooting each other like in the Wild West. And what's crazy is the guy he was shooting at, that guy later becomes a senator, and they work together. Wow. Like, he's the president. The other guy's a senator. I want to say his name was Benton, Senator Benton. He's like a senator from Missouri. And the United States was crazy back then.
Yeah, to say the least. Yeah. Moving on, like from Jackson into the next group. None of them really stood out to me too much. I feel like this group kind of gets glossed over a little bit until you get to Lincoln. But I don't know. Is there anything in there that like was like that group did? I think
they sucked. Yeah, so bad. When I was reading through those presidents,
a lot of expansion, right? That was kind of their main thing. That was expansion of territory.
Some more expansion. James K. Polk was all about expansion, and he's the one who did most of it. James K. Polk fought the war with Mexico, which captured Texas and the whole American Southwest, and he negotiated the Oregon Territory purchase or split with Great Britain. After that, you basically had modern boundaries, and Polk's a really interesting guy because he serves just one term. And he goes in and he says, like, there's 4 things I'm going to do. He does all of them, and then he quits, and then he leaves, and he walks away. And it's just like, wow, that was a really efficient president. Now, he gets that doesn't necessarily mean he's a good or a great president, because how he accomplishes those things is a lot of lying about stuff, a lot of sneak. Like he engineers this war with Mexico so we can capture the whole American Southwest. How does he do this? The United States had finally annexes Texas. And when we annex Texas, there's a dispute. Where is the boundary between Texas and Mexico? Right. Texas claims it's the Rio Grande, which it is today. Mexico claims it's the Nueces River, which is several hundred miles north of the Rio Grande. Okay, well, we should figure this out. How should we figure this out? We should probably be really delicate, be really careful. Let's not do anything to like heighten tensions. No, Polk puts an army on the Rio Grande River, like into this contested land, and he just marches it right into land that Mexico says is theirs, and then he's just like, come on, do something, Mexico, and eventually there's a fight, and then Polk's like, they killed American boys on American land. It was contested land, Abraham Lincoln is a congressman at this point, and he's like, show me the spot on the American map where this blood was shed. Why are we fighting this war? So that was Polk.
I think he was the only one to vote against that war, wasn't he?
There were more. He was one of the few. He did lose a seat in Congress for opposing the war, because it's very dangerous to oppose an American war when you're a politician. We talked about John Quincy Adams dying on the floor of Congress earlier. He opposed the war. He was like one of the true ringleaders against the war. And the way he died, because he viewed this as a war to expand slavery. This is really the issue. All these guys, Polk's dealing with expansion. Everybody else is dealing with slavery. What do we do about slavery? And they all make terrible decisions is what that next group of presidents is. And so we declare this war. We're going to get all this land. And John Quincy is like, we're just getting all the southern land so that the slavers can create more states, and they can increase their power in Senate and in Congress. And then they can force slavery back on the North where it's been abolished. Like, he viewed it as a power play. Wow. By slavers. And so even at the end of the war, like, we're having a vote to honor the generals for winning the war. You know, like the most, of course, thank you, generals, like the most no duh thing. And they do a voice vote. Who supports this? Everyone says yes. Who opposes it? And John Quincy Adams like, I oppose this. And he stands up to talk about why he opposes it. And then he has a heart attack right there in the middle of his protest vote. And he gets taken to the House Speaker office and he dies there in the Capitol protesting the expansion of slavery. But that was the real issue all these people were doing. First, there was a little expansion through Polk. You know, you have after Jackson, you have Martin Van Buren, and then Martin Van Buren loses to William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison dies 30 days later, and he gets replaced by John Tyler. And John Tyler wants to expand. He wants to expand into Texas. And he spends his whole administration trying to make that happen. James K. Polk, and he makes, like, the last day of office, he makes it happen. James K. Polk then starts this war. He gets this land. And when he gained all that land, like, this is when the road to the Civil War starts. Is that this whole group of presidents, they are the road to the Civil War because we have all this land and now we have to figure out what to do about the slavery question. Is slavery allowed in this land? Is it not allowed in this land? Who's deciding this stuff? How do we decide this stuff? And you have people come up with ideas like, well, we'll just let the territories vote if they want slavery or not. And that's democratic. That seems like a great idea. Let's let them decide. But the problem is that then people from other states start coming in and killing each other because they want to make sure the state goes their way. And now you have these like mini civil wars, like Kansas, bleeding Kansas happens in the 1850s. Several presidents are involved in that just terrible mess. And the last of this group of presidents before Lincoln is James Buchanan. James Buchanan becomes president. Like the country, everybody realizes the country's on fire. We've been mishandling the slavery question. People are fighting each other, killing each other in Kansas. Everyone's unhappy. The South is very antagonistic toward the North and the North toward the South over the slavery question. James Buchanan is one of the most experienced people ever elected president. Surely he's going to save the day, right? No. Before he's even president, he tempers in a Supreme Court case, the Dred Scott decision, which that might sound familiar to you. He calls up, if I remember right, the Chief Justice, if not, it's one of the justices on the court. And he tells the justice, like, hey, I want you to give me a definitive ruling on this that's going to end the question of slavery forever. And I'd like it to go like kind of a certain way. And the judge is like, sure. And so in James Buchanan, in his inaugural address, he pretends he has no idea how this case is going to go. And he says, we should just accept whatever the Supreme Court rules, and that will be the end of it. And then the Supreme Court rules that Black people can never be citizens. That's what the Dred Scott decision says. Black people can never be citizens. They can never be free. And that blows up in his face. It just ratchets up the tension higher. And by the time Lincoln's getting elected, you know, and some of this goes to news sources too. The Southern news sources were telling their readers that if Lincoln gets elected, he's going to take away all your slaves. He's going to end slavery. Your society will be destroyed. Your women will be raped. Your money will be taken away. You'll be forced to give your land to these Black people who are your slaves. You'll have to bow to them in the street. You know, like it freaks these people out. And so they secede and the Civil War starts. That's what that group all does. They just keep making bad decisions. And this shows, like, what this group really shows you is how important presidents are to the unity of the country and how bad presidents can feed into discord. And if they make the wrong decisions, like, you didn't have to necessarily have the Civil War. There were other countries that got rid of slavery without a civil war. Now, it would have been hard because of the way it's split up on the map and how important it was to the South. Maybe you did have to have a civil war. Who's to say? But the reason you had the Civil War when you had it, the reason it played out the way it played out is because we had a series, like 20 years of presidents who are making bad decisions from let's annex Texas, let's go to war, get all this land. When you get all this land, it reopens the question of are slaves allowed in that land or not? And then successive presidents making terrible decisions about what to do, ratcheting up tensions, antagonizing the sections against each other until eventually you do have a civil war. So like that's that whole bundle.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, as you mentioned, like each one of them, it's Zachary Taylor was a slave owner.
The funny thing about Zachary Taylor was the most pro-North anti-slavery president of them. But then he also died in office and he got replaced by Millard Fillmore, who didn't own slaves, but was one of the more pro-Southern guys, because everybody started realizing one of the reasons they made these bad decisions is because of the 2/3 clause in the Constitution, inflated the power of the South. And so all these guys who become president, they realize they're not going to win re-election. They're not going to get anything done without Southern support. And the only issue the South cares about is slavery. You know,
I was going to say each one of them, like progressively, it seems like from Taylor, Fillmore, Pierce, and they're all like basically pro slavery, I think. Yeah. And then, as you said, Buchanan comes in and he just says, well, this is what the law is. And like you said, he just, whatever, this is my hands are tied kind of thing. And then obviously that leads right into Abraham Lincoln and everything that he dealt with, which was a tremendous situation to have to deal with. And it, really cost him probably everything in the long run. Yeah.
His life.
Yeah. It was with Abraham Lincoln. Was he the first president to be assassinated?
Yeah, he was. Not the first attempt. Someone did try to kill Andrew Jackson. Their pistols jammed. Of course. And then Jackson beat them with a cane, because that's Andrew Jackson to a T. Of course, he'd be the first one someone tried to kill. And of course, he would personally beat the person with his cane when they failed. No, Lincoln is the first one to be assassinated. There had even been prior attempts on his life before the one that succeeded. He had to be smuggled into the Capitol, if I remember right, disguised as a woman to take office, to be sworn in, because he had to pass through Maryland, and Maryland was a slave state, and people were afraid that the people in Maryland might kill him. He was the first one to be assassinated, and then there were more after that, for sure.
I've always felt like from what I've read that he sort of maybe had this feeling that, like, I'm probably going to die. I'm probably going to get taken out. Like, he didn't seem like hey, we won the war and things are good now. It seemed like there was just always this foreboding when it came to Lincoln and how he kind of viewed things from what I've read. But
yeah, he was also a guy. It's funny because when you hear stories of Lincoln, you hear greatest president ever, really good sense of humor. That's usually what you hear about him. But he was also a guy that suffered from depression, right? Which is another one of these important stories, because people suffer from depression today. And if you could tell them, so did Lincoln, that, that's kind of like, that's kind of good context to have. Yeah. And so I do think he had this sense of foreboding, and how could you not? I mean, just how could you not? If he didn't think about it, someone might try to kill me. I just imagine it must have passed through his mind at times. And, one of the sad ironies is that what gets Lincoln killed? What happens is the Civil War is basically won. We've captured Richmond. Lincoln goes out and he gives a speech. And in this speech, he says, you know what? I freed the slaves. We've won this war. I think that the African Americans who served in the army, they should probably be allowed to vote. I think we should give black people the vote. And in the audience is John Wilkes Booth. And he's like, no. And so he kills Lincoln. That's one of the last speeches Lincoln gives. And that's the trigger of his demise. So much of our history is wrapped around that.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of obviously a lot of little conspiracies around John Wilkes Booth and how that who he might have been tied to, that there might have been either ties to who was the South's leader at that time, the president that was in hiding,
Jefferson Davis.
There might have been a conspiracy there, or that even some of Lincoln's own people in Washington D.C. may have been kind of like Andrew Johnson's kind of been mentioned, I think, as someone who may have been involved to cede the power. But I don't know.
I'm one who generally doesn't believe conspiracy theories. I'm generally whatever the easiest explanation is, the most obvious is, that's probably the true one,
Right.
Now, every now and then one proves true, and then you're like, well, shit. But with Lincoln, I think it's fairly clear cut that John Wilkes Booth killed. Sometimes it happens. It's one of the things is humans, we struggle with how random history can be sometimes. It's hard to believe that history can change so much just because one guy, one person, one otherwise meaningless and significant person decided he wanted to kill somebody. And it's like, what? U.S. history turned on a dime because of that? Like, really? There's got to be more to it. Sometimes that's all there is.
Yeah. Yeah. Even if you go back, even thinking even further back in history, how fleeting life has been and how frivolous people have taken it just to change that dynamic of power and shift the course of history. Back when we were much less civilized than we hopefully are today.
Yeah.
Moving on. I think, I don't know much about Johnson except that he was, I think, a drunk. But
Johnson was one of the first stories, one of the first introductions the United States at large got to Andrew Johnson was on Inauguration Day, when Abraham Lincoln wins re-election, and it's time for Andrew Johnson to get up and give a speech.
Right.
And Andrew Johnson was sloshed. He was so drunk, he made no sense. He was slurring his words together. And everybody on the stage behind him was just like, oh my God, what have we done? So, yeah, he could drink a bit. That his real problem was that he was an insecure prick who grew up very poor, but always feeling like at least I'm better than black people.
What, wasn't he an indentured servant?
Yeah, he was at one point. He was in his childhood, he ran away from it. He was at one point an indentured servant to a tailor, if I remember right, and he ran away. He's one of the true, like, from nothing to the presidency guys in U.S. history. And yet, because of where he came from and what he was taught, so much of his self-worth was from a young age, and at least I'm better than black people. At least I'm better than slaves. And so when he's now put in charge of Reconstruction, he's also really resentful against like rich white people in the planter class. So like that's why he was the only Southerner to support the North during the Civil War, like the only Southern senator, because he resented the planter class and how they treated him. But now after the war, he also resents black people. And so he did everything he could to hurt the freedmen and set them back, to the point of getting impeached, surviving the Senate barely by, impeachment's a very broken process, by the way, talking about things that are wrong in the system. He basically bought off senators to survive impeachment. But these were the things that made him a bad leader: the hatred in his heart and his inability to see human potential in people he resented.
So we really only had one. Was Grant the only president that really sort of tried to embrace Reconstruction? Because didn't Hayes right after Grant kind of like cut off or put the kibosh on Reconstruction?
Yes and no. Yes, in terms of effectively, who was effective at doing Reconstruction? Only Grant. And he destroyed the first Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was dead for like 45 years after he was done with them. He invented the Justice Department he created to help fight white supremacy in the South.
Oh, wow.
He sent soldiers down there. Like, he did a lot of huge changes because he genuinely believed, like, I feel like when Grant came into office, he had a bracelet on his wrist that said, "What would Lincoln do?" Like that was the kind of how he started. But he had also been someone who had always opposed slavery based on his experiences and how he grew up. There was when he married his wife, he briefly got a slave. At some point, I think like an old army buddy maybe gave him a slave. I forget where he got it, but he at one point had a slave.
I heard the story. I heard how he got this was his only slave is what I heard is the story I heard. And that he often would spar with his father-in-law about slavery, and that on their wedding, for their wedding gift, the father-in-law gave him this slave as their wedding gift to like spite him.
might be. I can't remember how he got it.
It's a good story, I guess, but I don't know if it's
also,
true.
like, it might be one of the things maybe nobody's sure, but he set the guy free in an era when, and he was dirt poor. He was so poor that like he was out on the street corner in his old war outfit selling wood, penniless. And instead of selling a slave, and you could get a year's wages from selling a slave, you could have gotten thousands of dollars. Instead of doing that, he set the guy free. You know, so like that is showing Grant's character. Early before he's anybody, like he's a nobody, a poor beggar soldier who's gotten a lot of bad breaks and is reduced to selling wood on the corner to try and take care of his family. And when he becomes president, he really picks up the fight, and he views this fight's not over. You know, what was the Civil War about? It's about a more perfect union and freedom and democracy for all. And what's happening in the South is not that. And we need to address that. And he spent his whole time trying to address it. Toward the end of his term, he did start removing some of the soldiers from the South. And I can't remember if his hand was kind of forced on that or not. But that leads to Hayes, who you mentioned. When Hayes gets elected, it's a very, very close and controversial race where you have contested electors from certain states. And you have real danger of another civil war, of the South not accepting this. And a compromise is made where Hayes supporters tell supporters of the Southern guy, I want to say that guy's name was Tilden, but I could be wrong. And they say, hey, Southerners, if you let Hayes get elected, if you just let this happen, we'll remove the last troops from the South and we'll let you do what you want. And they say, sure. And so that ends it. Now, later presidents would try to pass laws and they would try to do things. It just wouldn't get anywhere because you still have the filibuster, which is starting to be used to squash these laws. And you still have, it's still the number one issue in the South. You have Benjamin Harrison. He's one of these forgotten bearded presidents of the late 19th century. And Benjamin Harrison tries to pass laws to protect Black African Americans in the South and enfranchise them and all that. And what happens is the Southern Democrats in Congress, who at that point, that was the conservative party, the Democrats were, they basically tell the Republicans, look, we'll help you pass everything you want if you help us oppose this. We'll give you all the other goodies. We will give you the barn if you help us block him on African Americans. And they do. Like the South was just so dedicated to it that other presidents, try as they might, could not get anything done. And so that was kind of one of the stories of the late 19th century and those presidents and why civil. And so eventually they stopped trying. You know, they realize it's just not going to happen. I'm going to spend my political capital on it. It's not going to happen. Let me spend my political capital somewhere else, helping other people some other way.
Touching back on Grant just a second, one of the things that I've heard, and I think it's true, but didn't he end up after his presidency? Didn't he end up kind of losing all his money and was basically poor again? Yes. and had to, like, Mark Twain sort of helped him write a book that I think he basically just barely completed before he died, and it set up his wife was taken care of, but like he kind of died broke more or less. Yeah, you got all that right. Kind of sad. Got all that right. Yeah, very sad. He after the presidency, he was like one of the most popular people in the world. He was traveling around. He had all these people want to do business with him. Grant's problem was always picking the wrong friends. And so he picked the wrong friend to go into business with. And the guy he went into business with, the way the business worked was Grant was the front, he was the face, and he was out there like making friends and getting money in. And then his partner was supposedly investing this money really wisely and making profits. And, you know, look at the books. The books say we're getting amazing returns. This is great. And then one day that partner just like, he like ran off like with the money or something. Like there's literally a day where Grant's son, who's also part of the business, walks into Grant's office and is like, our partner's gone and we have no money. And Grant is like, oh. And that's it. And there's no protections back then. You know, there's no laws protecting you if this happens to you. And so he suddenly has zero money and he goes to broke. And so he befriends Mark Twain. He writes his biography as he's dying of throat cancer because Grant loved to smoke cigars. So he's dying of this really painful throat cancer. And
And it's so terrible. Like reporters are just like showing up at his doorstep waiting for him to die. Like, is he dead yet? No? All right. Well, maybe later. Like just terrible. And his biography is considered like the gold standard for political, military, presidential biographies. Like any president later who tried to write a biography, like Eisenhower, when Eisenhower writes his biography, he gets his people together and he's like, this is Grant's biography. We want to emulate this. Like it is the gold standard for recounting, it's so well written. I read it when I was younger. It's a really good book. But yeah, a very sad end and then after he dies, his political enemies, as part of this lost cause myth, the Southerners who resent him so, they paint a new picture of him. When he died, he was a hero of the Republic, one of the biggest funerals, one of the most beloved people. And over the next 100 years, he was turned into this drunk who was super corrupt and could do nothing right. Like that's the revenge that he had for him.
I almost feel like there was this impression that I was given when I was younger that the reason he was broke at the end was because he was a drunk. And
right.
And, as you dig into it, it's not really the case at all.
Yeah, it's not really the case. There's one point early in his career where he got fired from the army in a Western post. This is pre-Civil War. He's out in California at a time when nobody lives in California and you're in the middle of nowhere. And like, what are you going to do with your time? And he tried several business ventures and failed. And he might have gotten drunk there. Like, there's no record of why he was fired. Right. He was just fired. And so maybe then. But the rest of his life, like there's no record or evidence that he was an alcoholic or an abusive drinker.
Yeah. Yeah. Moving on from him and kind of going into the next, and, stop me if I'm skipping over anybody that's like important or has anything interesting. But the next one that really kind of strikes me is Teddy Roosevelt, like as kind of a change of what we have had up to that point. Again, another standout.
Huge change.
Kind of a guy who my understanding is he was pretty weak as a kid, had some health ailments, and basically like just forced himself into being a rough and tumble guy, and really made his mark as an outdoorsman and a fighter to a large extent.
Teddy Roosevelt is really interesting to me. All the things you said is true. He was an asthmatic when he was a kid. He needed glasses. He was wimpy, but he was super into trying to prove his manliness through toughness. And so like he would box and he tried to play football and like all these things, and he came from tremendous wealth. Like he might have been one of the wealthiest people to ever become president. Certainly the wealthiest since like Thomas Jefferson. Like he had so much money, he could do whatever he wanted.
Where did his money come from?
Like his grandfather or great grandfather, his family had been in New York for generations. And you remember earlier we were talking about Andrew Jackson. He dicks around with the banks, and then there's this big depression. During that big depression, Teddy Roosevelt's ancestor made some smart investments and suddenly built a company, like a window glass company, and he made a fortune. And so that's where Theodore Roosevelt's wealth came from, is he had an ancestor who did the right, like when the economy's low, you know what they say, buy low, sell high. His grandfather bought low, and it worked out really well for him, So that's where all this money comes from. And that gives him the freedom to kind of just have these crazy adventures and be this character. Like we all love him because of the crazy stories about him. He was so charismatic, like he ran off and he was a rancher for a while, The things that you don't see about him is like he was a failure at a rancher. And why did he became a rancher? It's really sad. He marries the love of his life, a woman named Alice, and she's pregnant and she's going to have a child, and she dies during childbirth. And it's the same day his mother dies in the same house. His mother and his wife die on the same day. And his diary is just the letter X that day. The light has gone out of my life. It's so sad. And how he responds to this is he gives his daughter to like his sister. And then he just like books it out to the Dakotas and buys a ranch and decides to be a rancher for a few years. Like he abandons everything. He abandons his child. Like it's like we love Theodore, but there's those also parts of his life that when you look at him, you're like, wait, you did what?
Again, complex humans, you know.
Very complex human. Like his daughter's fascinating, by the way. She gives the best quotes about everybody. She ends up growing up with a sharp wit. She's like an American princess because she's also, you know, got all the wealth and stuff. But like he can't even bring himself to like say her name because she's named Alice after her mother who died. Like so many like psychological traumas going on in this family. So Theodore Roosevelt, we love him. Here are other reasons we love him. We love him because when the Spanish-American War breaks out, he was pro-war. He quits his job to go fight. How great would it be if any politician who voted for war had to quit their job and go fight? You know, like how would that change the way we support wars? They never do that. They vote for the war and then they stay home and, you know, make rich selling war materials or something. Roosevelt goes fight, but he's the fightingest guy ever. He wants to fight everybody. He's constantly trying to get the United States in wars. And is that really good? Like, is it really good that he was trying to constantly pick wars? Not when he's president, but when he's not president, you know? So he's very pugilistic. In some ways, he is more Trumpian than anybody realizes. In the way he taught the bellicosity and the way he gets up and starts yelling and riles people up. Someone told me a story once that he punched a man on stage at a debate once. Like, that's insane. That's insane. So Teddy Roosevelt, it's like there's all these charismatic things that you love and you hear about, and you realize it's so hard not to love him, but he's also insane. And if he existed today, half of us would hate him and think he was terrifying. So really interesting guy. But the reason he's important in terms of what he changed, he's the first progressive president. That's really the important thing. And why is he progressive? Because we've been talking about you need to change with the times or bad things are going to happen. And he sees the divide between rich and poor getting crazy. He sees the slums. He sees how people are being treated. And he realizes that if he doesn't address this, you know, the people will rise and tear everything down. You know, so he's a progressive as an act of preservation for his class and his wealth and all that. And other rich people don't get it. They don't want to share the wealth. They think they can just hold on to it forever. He's like, no, we need to do something to address this or they're going to come and take it. And that's kind of where his progressivism is formed. And he starts an era that lasts basically for 20 years of progressivism. He's followed by Taft. We don't think of Taft as progressive, but he's more progressive than a lot of other guys at that point. And then Wilson, who is very progressive. Like Taft is the one who gets an amendment passed to create an income tax that didn't exist before then. Like, you know, you don't write off Taft and his progressive credentials just because he's not, you know, Wilson or Teddy or FDR. He was still a pretty progressive guy. So he starts a 20-year progressive era where you get all these laws and all these changes. You know, you get trust busting. Companies are really starting to be taken on. We're trying to take the power away from them. You get income tax. So now the government's funded more equitably, whether before it was all, like I mentioned, tariffs, you know, and who pays the most in tariffs? Really, that affects poor Americans more than rich Americans, you know? Yeah. So that's where his stamp is by a fluke. Because someone killed William McKinley, some crazy person killed William McKinley, and Teddy Roosevelt was in the vice presidency. He was put in the vice presidency because vice presidents never become anything. It was done to kill his career and get him out of the way. He was governor of New York and he was annoying the people in New York, so they moved him to vice president. Now he's president and he can unleash progressive populism, and that leads to 20 years of progressive reform.
Yeah. Do you know the story of San Juan Hill? I've heard that, you know, again, it was a story I was taught as a child in school, and, you know, Teddy Roosevelt led the charge and we won. But yeah. I've also heard different perspectives that say that he was actually kind of maybe reckless. Like if you actually looked at the actions that day, he actually may have gotten a lot of his men killed and sort of was fortunate that it came out the way it did. But I don't know if there's any truth to that. The way you were saying, like how he was kind of reckless, and that story kind of dinged in my mind. I was like, maybe that was an early indicator that he really was, wild as hell.
Yeah, so as I recall, and here's the thing: is you'll read different things that'll be more or less critical of him. I remember seeing some accounts that were more critical, some accounts that were like, "Oh my God, he's a hero." He in the battle at San Juan Hill. This is a battle where the United States is invaded Cuba to take it from the Spanish, and the Spanish are holed up in this one port, and there's these two hills that overlook the port. And if we can take those hills, we can put cannons on them, and then we can blow up the Spanish Navy, and the town will have to surrender. So this is the whole game. The whole game is capture these two hills. And the Americans come up, and they start attacking up the hills. The Spanish are pretty well fortified, though. And Teddy and his Rough Riders get to one of the hills, and there's all these army regulators kind of hiding in the grass because they're like, we don't want to go up there. Like, they're going to kill us. And crazy Teddy is like, I'm going to go. Let's go. And he starts running up, and he kind of shames everybody into going with him. And they charge up the hill, and they capture the hill. If I remember right, by the time they get to the top, like it might have been abandoned. Like the Spanish might have fled before he did. I can't remember if they were still there or not. And Teddy's like, all right, let's go capture the next hill. And let's go. And he starts running. And he runs like, I don't know, 100 feet or 100 yards or something before he realizes nobody's following him. And he's like, oh, damn it. And he runs back and he's like, follow me. And then they go again and, they capture second hill. Now, it's not like Teddy won that battle. He was leading a charge, so you could certainly make the argument people died because he made them charge. Right. He made them attack. Somebody had to do it. I guess you could have just kept shooting up the hill until the Spaniards left. So, I'm that's where I am. I might not have all the information, though. So that's an area where I'd encourage more reading for sure. For sure. All these areas, it's all based on what I've read. I might not be right. Everybody go read more stuff. Absolutely.
I encourage everybody, you should go out and do their own reading on these things. The other thing that stood out for me that I'm very thankful to him for, I don't know what sparked it or whatever, but I'm so happy that he, did created the national park system.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Super big for that. The one other story about him that kind of always sticks out is again, it could not be a true story, but he was giving a speech and he got shot in the chest. And I guess he had something in his pocket that maybe absorbed the impact mostly, but like continued giving the speech after getting shot in the chest, which
he was on his way to give a speech.
Okay.
When someone shoots him in the chest, and the folded speech is what slows the bullet. And then he looks at like the blood and he's like, you know what? I've been in war. I can walk around with this for a little bit. And then he goes to the area and he stands up and he gives his speech and he holds up like the speech with a bullet in it. And he gives a speech with a bullet inside him. And then he goes to the hospital. And if I remember right, I want to say that happened during like the 1912 presidential campaign. Yeah. Like he's running for re-election after being out of office, and it's the last week. Like this was the October surprise of that election, is the attempted assassination of Teddy Roosevelt. And yeah, these are like I said, there's so many stories about him. He's so larger than life that you're like, oh man, this is amazing. He's so fun. But then there's all the other stories we don't tell as much about him that make him look insane.
Yeah, for sure. As moving on from Teddy, you mentioned Taft and Woodrow Wilson. After Wilson, he's starting to deal with World War I. And then the next ones, I feel like Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, Hoover. I feel like that group, I don't know. The only thing I really know about that group is that I think they were somewhat corrupt and prohibition.
Prohibition
from that era.
Yeah. So what's interesting about this group, this is in my podcast where I am right now. If you picked up the latest episode, I think the episode on Coolidge might come out tomorrow.
Nice.
But we're recording this on, what day is today? We're recording this 13th. On Sunday, November 13th. I think maybe it just came out. So this group is kind of the conservative strike back is this group. You had 20 years of progressives, and then you get Warren Harding elected. And he starts to run a more progressive playbook. He dies in office. Calhoun Coolidge follows that conservative playbook. And then he gets replaced by Hoover after he steps aside. Hoover was his Secretary of Commerce, and Hoover tries to run a more progressive playbook. Now, what's happening during this time? You mentioned Prohibition. I was amazed how little any of the presidents were involved in Prohibition. It was something that would be part of party platforms, but like Wilson wasn't really involved in getting it passed. Also, like, it's so weird. There were a lot of constitutional amendments that happened on Wilson's presidency that he had nothing to do with. Women got the right to vote. He didn't, like, he supported that very late in the game after opposing it most of his presidency. The direct election of senators is passed. Before that, senators were generally still picked by their state assemblies, you know? So you had a lot of major changes. And this is a reactionary period against some of these changes. For example, a big thing is tax rate changes. I mentioned Taft passed the first income tax. World War I happens. Wilson raises taxes to pay for the war. At the end of World War I, the richest Americans, any Americans making more than $200,000 a year in $17, is paying like 75% taxes on any dollar past 200,000. You know, really high tax. Like that's compared to today, astronomical. And the lowest paying Americans are paying like 1.5% or 4%. And so Harding and Coolidge start rapidly lowering that tax bracket. It's so crazy. They put in charge of the Treasury the second richest man in America, a guy who owns a bank that's still around. I'm blanking on his name. It might have been Mellon, which still exists. If it might ring a bell, Mellon Bank. And the super rich guy, he's Secretary of Treasury, and he's like, you know what? We'll make more money if we lower taxes on rich people. He basically like, this is the start of like modern conservative thought in terms of trickle down economics.
Yeah.
And we'll raise tariffs, you know, and he starts trying to set the clock back. Let's start taking apart some of this regulation stuff. For example, Coolidge stops hiring meat inspectors, you know, and he dismantles the railroad oversight people, you know, like they start trying to roll this stuff back. And for 20 years, you know, when you have absolutely no controls on kind of what things are happening, the economy can really start going crazy. Good. So it starts booming at the roaring 20s. And then it all crashes right after Calvin Coolidge leaves. Calvin Coolidge is the biggest, like, don't do anything president ever. One of his quotes was, if you see 10 problems coming down the road, 9 will probably go into the ditch on their own. Don't worry about it. You know? And yeah, I know. It's like, wait, what?
It's not the kind of leadership I would want.
Exactly. One of his other mantras, don't do anything yourself that someone else can do for you. Like he was just the personification of the government that governs best is the government that governs least. And after he leaves office, you have the Great Depression. And the irony about the Great Depression, Hoover was famous for leading relief efforts during World War I and after World War I, food relief efforts. Like he kept millions of Europeans fed with a charity and philanthropy he did. And he led the reaction to this great flood on the Mississippi River during Coolidge's presidency when he's Secretary of Commerce. So when people elect Hoover, nobody knows the Great Depression's coming. But if you had told them it was coming, they probably would have elected Hoover and been like, he's the one guy who can save us.
Right.
And he tries all these progressive things, but they're all basically half measures. He doesn't go far enough. And so he ends up getting blamed for it. He makes some other mistakes. He doesn't know how to play the political game and work with Congress very well. And that's what sets up FDR and the second progressive age, which will last like another 20 years. So Harding, Coolidge, Hoover is kind of this interregnum of reactionary rollback, a reactionary conservative rollback that leads to like a really good economy for a decade, and then the Great Depression for a decade. And then you again flip the switch toward the progressive side of the country. You talked about corruption. Warren Harding's the one who's known for corruption.
Okay.
He wasn't himself corrupt, but he hired a lot of friends who were. If you probably like read Teapot Dome Scandal when you were a kid, which was basically his interior secretary giving drilling rights to a company for huge personal cash payments to government land. So he's like selling oil to companies for big kickbacks. The bigger scandal in my mind was the Veterans Bureau scandal. We talked earlier about veterans and taking care of them. After World War I, they created the Veterans Bureau, which was supposed to help the veterans with ailments, get some supplies, get them medical supplies, maybe build some hospitals, stuff like that. The guy in charge of this, though, he decides, you know what, if somebody wants to build a hospital for veterans and I'm trying to decide who should build it, I'm going to hire whoever gives me the most money. And you know what? I feel like I have a lot of medical supplies for veterans. Like, they probably don't need all that. Who wants to buy them from me? Who wants to buy all these medical supplies from me? Yeah, this guy just like fleeces the government and the veterans. It's like the most evil thing you could do, getting rich by selling stuff and profiting off the suffering of veterans. So those two things happen. Harding wasn't involved in either. He was horrified by both, but he unfortunately died before he could really vindicate himself with the public. And then Coolidge just steps as far away from him as possible. Coolidge wasn't corrupt. Hoover wasn't corrupt. But you did have a lot of corrupt things under Harding during that age.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talked about the 20 or 30 years of progressivism, and then this group coming through and this pendulum swinging back the other way with the conservatism. And I think during this time, maybe I hope I'm not getting my dates too out of whack, but this deregulation, when you talked about getting rid of the meat inspectors, I think that's what led to the Hell's Kitchen kind of era, and when there a huge breakout about some meat being contaminated later after all the deregulation occurred.
I'm not sure about what happened. I may be
making this up completely
as he fired that, but there was when it was put in place by Teddy Roosevelt in the first place.
Yeah.
Teddy Roosevelt passed all this stuff, meat inspection, in response to a book that was looking at the meat factories and just how unsanitary they were. The Jungle is, I think, the name of it.
I'm sorry, that's what I was trying to think of.
So that was 20 years early, and that's what got this stuff passed in the first place.
I see.
Yeah.
But I guess the other thing I was really kind of looking at there too is that it seems like it harkens back to the very beginning of our conversation where we were talking about democracy being something you constantly work at. If you have too long of a period of maybe extreme progressivism, maybe that's not the great thing. Maybe too long of a period of extreme conservatism is not so good of a thing. Maybe it is a good thing to kind of have them change off every few years, or maybe not be so extreme would be nice as well.
It just depends. You're trying different things, and some things work, some things fail, and so what are we trying today? Are we trying things that are considered more progressive? Are we trying things that support the poorer classes? Are we trying things that support the richer classes? Which ideas that the other thing is, when a party tries some ideas, it's very hard to admit your ideas were wrong. So you kind of do need the other party to come in, and hopefully they only repeal the stuff that actually didn't work. Now, I feel like today we're a little broken, and each party is going to repeal anything they can from the other party, whether it's working or not. They just and they won't support anything the other party wants, no matter what the evidence is, because it's become too tribal. But you would hope in a healthy democracy, it is psychologically easier for another party to come in and say, okay, Woodrow Wilson, you just segregated the government for the first time ever. That's not good. Let's repeal that. Let's let white and black people work together again, because that was stupid. You things like that. Or hey, maybe there were other ideas that people tried that it's just not quite working. Let's repeal it. It's easier to be the other party and do that, and you hope that the other party really focuses on the things that are broken instead of just wholesale throw it all out.
Yeah, I feel like people just get caught up and they think, unfortunately, there's always there's this thing that I think exists called policy lag, where, you've got this period from where policy is put in place from when it actually down the road is taking effect and having an impact in the markets and with the citizens. And oftentimes, you have these, successful, flourishing times like the Roaring 20s, and you think it's because of maybe that the 20s were set up because of all this, all the policy that was passed during the 20s, but it may have actually been the policy that was set up leading into the 20s that created those circumstances for the 20s to be flourishing. And maybe the 20s policy is what actually created the Great Depression,
Absolutely.
And so that's why I say I think it takes a little bit of balance between the two somehow, if we're going to stay in this two party sort of dichotomy that we're in it, that we've been in forever, it seems like.
Yeah. And the other thing is, the economy is a complicated thing, and it's impacted a lot by stuff the government has nothing to do with. Sometimes it soars or fails because of things entirely out of the government's control, like the spread of mass production or the invention of the internet or subprime housing mortgages. Sometimes it's the government, especially areas where it's really easy to point to is tariffs, especially because when you're raising or lowering tariffs, you're picking winners or losers for industries in the economy. And that is one of the most impactful things a government can do to have an immediate impact on the economy. Other things, it takes longer, there's more of a lag on other things. Or they might be things that don't affect economy. They just think affect equality. And you think that's important, like your tax policy. Your tax policy is probably not going to really impact the government or the economy too much, how much you're taxing wealthy people versus poor people. But it will impact how much money those people have to spend on things and how and what you're able to afford as a government, what programs you can support. And so it's more like that. Those policies are more kind of like, how are we creating a more just or equitable society? And what do we consider a just society? I think the two parties disagree, on that. And equitable, they probably disagree on what equitable is, one party might say equitable is everybody should be taxed the same rate. And the other party might say equitable is everybody should have the same economic opportunities for success, or everybody should be able to put food on their plate. That's equitable. So, it's funny. Everyone's chasing just and equitable. They just define them differently.
Yeah, that's sort of where we've broken into. I think today we've devolved a little bit to where we no longer have the common ground of even terminology that we can base the conversation to have off of anymore. Yeah. So it's become much more complicated even than it used to be.
Yeah.
Let's see. We were coming up on, I think, two more very interesting presidents going into World War II with Franklin and Roosevelt and Harry Truman. Franklin Roosevelt, somebody that's related to Teddy, I think, was a distant cousin or something along those lines.
Yeah, I want to say Eleanor was Teddy Roosevelt's niece, I think. And I just remember, I know that at the wedding, Teddy Roosevelt shows up at Franklin's wedding to Eleanor, and he slaps Franklin on the side and says, "Way to keep the name in the family." So there's my story for you about that.
There you go. Yeah. But, I think the stories that have always really caught me, that have always impressed, I don't know if it's impressed, but I found interesting, have been the conversations and his relationship with Churchill. Because Churchill, I always feel like was this revered figure for so long, but as I've read more, it really feels like Franklin Roosevelt was like this cool guy that Churchill wanted to be best friends with. And the story that always kind of culminates this to me, or really, highlights this, is the story around when Churchill and Roosevelt met with Stalin at Yalta, and they're like, I guess the story kind of goes like that Churchill, they all get there, and Churchill keeps hitting up Roosevelt wanting to talk about what's their strategy going to be for the meeting with Stalin to get him to join their side in the war. Yeah, and he keeps bugging him throughout the day, and finally they get to the meeting, and they're sitting at the table, and he basically makes fun of Churchill, how he looks. Yeah. He's like, isn't he a funny, stupid looking dude, funny looking guy? And Stalin laughs. They smoke cigars and drink whiskey, and they're best buds, and they're all in the war together after that. But just kind of like that dichotomy of their relationship has always been very interesting between such important world leaders.
Yeah. They, they were two guys who realized friendship can go a long way, and it's really important to be friends with influential people. And so they wanted to be friends with each other. And they saw each other as pivotal to their futures. Now, when it came to Stalin, Churchill, strategically is like, I don't want to be Stalin's friend. Stalin scares the hell out of me. I'm really close to him. I can see him right over there across the river, across the English Channel. He's just over in Eastern Europe. And he's scary to me. I don't like him. And Roosevelt was like, let's see if we can have a friendly relationship so we can win this war and have a nice peace afterwards. So you choose who you want to be friends with, and then you do everything you can to kiss the ass of your friends in politics and tweak your enemies. And so Roosevelt tweaking Churchill was his way to ingratiate himself with Stalin, but it in no way meant that he didn't have a great relationship with Churchill also. Like Roosevelt and Churchill were very tight, and Churchill was super upset and concerned when Roosevelt died, because he had spent so much equity building that relationship with the president of the United States, and now the guy's dead, and now you have Truman, and you're like, okay, shit, I need to build a relationship with Truman ASAP because I want to be able to influence him, and it's going to be a lot easier if he likes me and if he trusts me. So these relationships, the power players and how they interact with each other and what they think of each other. And who they pick to be their foils and who they pick to be their friends. Churchill, you might say early in his career, fairly early on, before many other people in England had, he picked Hitler as his foil. Hitler's crazy. That guy's insane. He's our enemy. We shouldn't be his friend, And he was proven right when World War II came around, and that's how he became prime minister. So of course he would then be very much like, he's not just looking at his friends, but he's like, okay, who's the next enemy? And let me make sure that I'm clearly calling them out as the enemy. That's important for my political future, to be right about who the enemies are. And then let me try to start building a coalition against that enemy. I think one thing Churchill knew is it's a lot easier to unify people against an enemy, than with anything else. People, it's the most, sadly, crazily, it's like one of the most unifying things you can have is an enemy that you all hate together. One thing, look at world history and the history of revolutions. Whenever there's a revolution in the country, it's because a group of different people has temporarily come together because they hate the monarch, and that's the enemy. Or whoever the leader is. The second that leader is gone, that group of people, they don't have someone to hate together anymore. They start fighting each other. It happens every single time, So as World War II is ending, Churchill is sitting there. He's like, okay, I've gotten buddy-buddy with the Americans. We've got this coalition. We just won World War II. Hitler's about to be gone. I need a new enemy. It's going to be Stalin, and he was right there, too, because Stalin was batshit crazy. One of the weird things about Stalin, too, I was shocked by this when I read books, and I'm reading about Eisenhower. So we're coming up on the end of my presidential knowledge, as I haven't done research beyond him yet until modern days would have lived through. But in each of these biographies, Roosevelt, Eisenhower, and Truman, whenever they meet Stalin, they all say the same thing. Stalin was such a nice guy. He was so grandfatherly. He gave off this grandfatherly vibe. He cares so much about his people. Stalin is a guy who kills millions of his own people. Yeah. Like he is a genocidal maniac, but he knows how to play this game of making friends also. He didn't become the leader by killing people. I mean, he kind of did. He became the leader by killing people, but he also became the leader by being friends and putting on a show. Yeah. And so when all these people meet him, they're like, everyone's just like, yeah, he's very grandfather. He's like a grandfather to the Russian people. He cares about them so much. It's really weird. It's really weird to keep reading this over and over again and be like, that guy's going to kill millions of his own people. What are you people smoking?
Yeah. Yeah. What was that transition like for in the middle of the war there from Roosevelt to Truman? Like, what was that transition like? Because didn't people kind of see Truman as a weak leader potentially?
Yeah, they saw him. Truman had initially gotten elected with the help of a political machine in Missouri, and he had barely won re-election in 1940. So he was kind of viewed as a bit of a crony to that machine, not necessarily super strong. not necessarily like he was just kind of a bit of an unknown. Certainly, nobody thought that he stacked up to FDR.
Right.
Like, nobody. I mean, FDR didn't even support him in his 1940 re-election bid. It's kind of it's kind of weird how he even became vice president. And he was involved in none of the discussions. He was totally like left out of it. So when FDR dies and Truman takes over, like he has to dive in. And yeah, just nobody knows what they're getting. Everybody's concerned. FDR has gotten us this far. He's gotten us out of the Depression. He's won the war. But okay, who's going to win the peace? Okay, who's going to, like, coming out of war is really rough economically. Yeah. Who's going to make sure we weather that okay? There were a lot of major problems like right there. And now we have Truman. None of us voted for Truman. Nobody cares about the vice president really. What's going to happen? And so luckily Truman's a hardworking guy who hits the books and he just starts reading, getting up to speed all that he can. He's pretty quickly told about this atom bomb, this crazy thing. And he's like, oh my God. And he decides to use it, against the Japanese. And he decides to tell his allies about the atomic bomb that we have. And it tells the Soviets about the atomic bomb that we have. And he is just very quickly trying to build these relationships also. He's got to build a relationship, with Churchill. Can he build a relationship with Stalin? How is he going to build, the new world order? And it was a huge challenge dumped on his lap that he had to weather.
Mm. Was the creation of the atomic bomb, was the Manhattan Project, was that going on under Truman or under Roosevelt?
Roosevelt. It was basically already done when Truman becomes president. Like, they're like, hey, I think they complete their first successful test of a bomb shortly after he becomes president. But this thing in fact, this is crazy. So before he's even vice president, he's a senator. And he's on this committee. He forms a committee basically to look for waste in the war. Because, one of the ways to win a war, one of the ways to lose a war is to be inefficient with your materials. So you're trying to find waste. Where are we being wasteful in ship construction? Where are we being wasteful in this, that, or the other? And as he's in charge of this committee, reports start coming to him of all these resources being gobbled up by this mysterious project called the Manhattan Project. And he reaches out to the Secretary of War and he's like, hey, I see all this stuff being consumed. I don't see any output for it. What is this? And the Secretary of War simply replies like, it's important. I can't tell you. And and please back off. And he backs off. And then when he becomes president, he finds out what this secret project was. And he's like, oh, I understand now.
Wow.
So that was his awareness. His awareness was he knew there was this thing out there that was consuming all this money, a ton of money, a ton of resources, this black hole. And he knew it was important because the army had told him, just trust us. It's important. Please don't ask any more questions. It's a secret. And he said, okay. And then he became president. He found it out. And that's kind of that answer.
And did he do anything with policy during this time that, because I think I read that his background was in finance. Did he do any policies that kind of helped keep us from having, going into a reset or having economic difficulties? Because after the war, it was we went into a period of economic growth, I think, for several years.
There was a hiccup and then a growth, which is also what happened after World War I. It's really interesting. Wars, especially World Wars where we're selling stuff to other countries. If there's a war where we get to sell stuff to someone else, really good for the economy. Yeah. Really good. After the war, really tough. There's going to be the soldiers are coming back. How do we get them jobs? What the hell are we doing? Right. And then after that sorts itself out, there's a boom again. So that's the roaring 20s. World War I, big boom. After war, a couple years of really sharp recession, and then roaring 20s. After World War II, big boom. Afterwards, a small recession, but he does weather it pretty well. And there's things like the GI Bill to help soldiers get back. So there's a lot more stuff in place. And then 50s, you get a nice little boom.
Yeah.
His background was really interesting. He got into politics really late, Harry Truman. I think he was 40 before he ever ran for office or entered politics. Oh, wow. He was a farmer growing up. He fought in World War I. He tried to own like a clothing store with a war buddy after World War I. It went out of business during that brief little blip. I mentioned that downturn after World War I. He got caught up in that. Then he becomes a politician later in life. And he's not like a super educated guy. So he's not like a financial wizard or anything. But he is looking for, like I mentioned, that committee. He's looking for waste in the government. He's looking for, are we spending our money efficiently, wisely, judiciously? And as the government comes out of World War II, you're starting to have struggles there, he does get involved in some very big issues. You have some large strikes that he gets involved in. I'm trying to remember which industry it is. I think it's the rail industry. I think. It's either rail or coal. Those are the two big ones, rail and coal. And the issue is that the workers in the industry, or during the war, that's usually a great time for labor to make some advances, because you have all these guys being sent off. So management can't fire you because there's no one else to hire, So that's a great time to be like, I want more money and I want to work fewer hours. And you get that. You're going to get that during a big war like that. And then after a war, management's going to be like, I'm cutting your pay, I'm increasing your hours. And people don't like that, So after World War II, this happens in one of these industries. And the laborers are like, well, here, like they put out a proposal that seems reasonable, and the owners refuse to budge, which is usually how these things play out. And Truman threatens to just seize either all the railroads or all the mines and put the government in charge and give the employees everything they want. And he actually goes out. It's this crazy moment. I'm so sad that things weren't recorded back then like they are today. He goes out to give a speech before Congress. He's standing at the podium and he announces, like, I approve the seizing of these businesses so the government can run it and keep them running, and to avoid a strike, because there's going to be a strike otherwise. And if you have a strike, a coal strike or a rail strike, those are huge bad news that affects everybody. So it's like, I'm going to do this to avoid the strike. I'm coming in on the side of labor. And right as he says that, the thing is, they're still negotiating, like his administration still support negotiating. While he's giving the speech, the negotiators reach a compromise, and somebody runs up to him on the podium and gives him a paper. And right after he says, I'm going to seize all this stuff, he looks at them and he's like, the ownership has given in to the laborers. The strike is avoided. All this is averted. Like, what an amazing moment. You give a speech saying, I'm going to seize this stuff to avoid the strike. Oh, ownership has given everything we want. Avoided. Never mind.
It all worked.
It all worked. Yeah. Just a crazy timing thing. So these are some of the things he's doing afterwards to try to take care of the economy. When these big strikes loom of management wanting to cut wages, raise hours back, and labor saying no, and you're going to have a strike, he picks a side and he tries to get involved and tries to have a good effect.
It's amazing. We've gotten up to Truman here at the end of World War II. And so many, even though I think for many people, this time period, especially early on, in the 1800s, is such a distant time period for people today. But even just discussing this and thinking about it, it's not that many generations ago. And a lot of the same issues, obviously things are very different today, but a lot of the same issues, it's economy, it's unfortunately now, I've never in my life, and I can remember growing up in the 80s and Russia was the big bad boogeyman and all that, but I don't think I've ever been at a time where I've really been concerned about a nuclear weapon that might be used. But, to have that even in the discussion these days, I think it's important for people to go back and, revisit, the history of having already done some of these things and see what those results were, and, maybe advise some caution on how we proceed moving forward for ourselves, even.
Yeah. Absolutely. There's lessons in history. You just got to look for them.
Well, I want to be cautious of your time, but I have, because I've taken up a pretty good bit of it here today. I would love to have you back on to chat about some others. I think we've cut it at an interesting place here, because really with Eisenhower leads into JFK, and from there it all sorts is like the second half of our history is almost how I feel like. So I think it's a good place to pause. I'd love to have you come back on, because this has been a really fun conversation for me, for sure.
Thanks. I would love to. We'll have to wait a couple years for me to read all that history. And once I have something to talk about, I'd love to come back on.
Oh, we can always come on and just shoot the shit, so to speak. I think obviously I'm not an expert on any of this, but I find it deeply fascinating. JFK's, and the whole, even there's so much around that, and his brother and Marilyn and all that, and leading into Nixon, such a fascinating character, I think, as well.
Nixon's crazy.
Such a crazy character. And then obviously most of the other stuff from Reagan on, at least, I've been around for, so
right.
I have some perspective on it. But yeah, amazing conversation, man. Really enjoyed it. Before you go today, tell people where they can check out your podcast and follow you online as well.
Yeah, my podcast is Abridged Presidential Histories. You can search it on any podcast platform or Google it and find it. Like I was saying earlier, each episode is 60 minutes or less on the setbacks, successes, and scandals of each president in order. I also, about halfway through around James Buchanan, I start interviewing historians. So for subjects that deserve a deeper dive, I'll bring a historian on and I'll talk to them and get that deeper perspective. You can find me all those places. I'm also I am on Twitter at APH Podcast. By the time this broadcast, I don't know if Twitter will cease to exist. That platform seems to be in the middle of a glorious, just meltdown explosion right now. But that's another place you can find me. And yeah, thank you so much. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, appreciate it. Well, thank you again so much. And have a good day.